Bom dia a todo mundo que está assistindo a gente aí. Agora a gente vai começar a nossa primeira mesa de comunicação aí do dia. Vou começar falando em português, mas a gente vai passar para o inglês já daqui a pouco. Então, eu fico muito feliz, né, de estar mediando essa mesa. É a penúltima mesa do dia, então a gente está ansioso aí, estamos ansiosos e ansiosas aí para fazer esse trabalho, finalizar aí com louvor, né? E tem sido muito especial participar disso. Eu queria muito agradecer também, né, ao canal Agenciamentos por estar cedendo o canal deles aí para gente fazer esse trabalho. E falar para vocês se inscreverem, se vocês quiserem, né, quem está assistindo aí, o público, se inscreverem, apertar ali para aparecer notificação, enfim, quando tiver novos vídeos. A gente vai ter uma outra mesa de comunicação depois dessas, 10 horas da manhã. Mas agora a gente vai começar essa, tá? Então agora eu vou para o inglês. Então, antes de ir para o inglês, só avisando mesmo que vocês podem fazer perguntas. A gente vai ter uma sessão de perguntas quando eles terminarem cada um a sua fala. Eles vão fazer a fala deles em inglês agora, cada um vai ter 20 minutos. E aí, depois que eles terminarem a fala, vocês podem aí fazer questões já, desde já, que a gente vai ler as questões e eles vão responder, tudo bem? Now I will pass to the English, okay? So let's go. Welcome, everyone. I don't know if I say good morning or evening or night because our time difference. And I think it's very cool. So, anyway, I would like to warmly welcome everyone who is here with us. It's a great joy and I'm very happy about receiving you, everybody. But anyway, be everyone warmly welcome. So now we will start our first communication of the day, whose theme is Political Philosophy and Contemporary Themes, number 2. So I'll pass very quickly through the functioning of our communication, just for you that is watching us to know. Each one of them will have 20 minutes to do their presentation, and after they are done, after they're finished, we will do a quick question session with questions that may come from the chat or from any one of you guys that are presenting. I just ask for the participants to let me know first if you have any question by the private chat, so I can ask you to turn on your microphone to do the question, okay? But now you will start your presentation. So I will present Ray and Yasmin now. So the first one who will present is Ray. So here is Ray Cheung Warlike. I don't know exactly, I'm sorry how to pronounce, but the title of his research is A Philosopher's Eagerness, an Experience Sharing of Public Engagement, and he's from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, China. The next one is Yasmin de Oliveira Alves Teixeira. The title of her work me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
You're presenting the title of my you're saying the title of my presentation.
Okay, so I will say it again, okay? So the title of the research of Yasmin is The Warlike Logic of Power, from Clausewitz to Foucault. She's from Universidade Federal de São Paulo, Brasil, and Université Paris 8, França. Okay? Is everything all right with my connection? Okay, thank God. So we will start now with you, Ray. So I will put your presentation here now, and you have 20 minutes. So I pass the word to you now, okay? Good work.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm a PhD student from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. I've been thinking of, well, I work on ethics and using formal theories, especially decision theory, and hoping to extend it to through epistemology to game theory and how it could be applied to issues that's been pressing to all of us, such as global warming. And to think about that, I looked at the Sustainable Development Goal of the United Nations, and what it is for our practice, or for some policy that will over the governance of the United Nations, how it is that it's sustainable. Roughly put, it's about if sustainability. If a practice is sustainable, it is for it to be after 10 years. If 10 years later people have the same resources as we do, that's one way to formulate sustainability. But given that that's politics and policy, and it involves economics, because resources, especially an assumption in economics is the scarcity of resources and distribution of not only wealth but various other things. So that they interact very much with philosophy, ethics, politics, and even morality. And to start thinking about how one's theory in morality, in ethics, would be utilized in the public sphere, or at least how it is that philosopher, academics, we think about things that that concerns us, but there are various things that, for example, deep ecology. Okay, let me see. Yeah, so that's one thing that I try to tackle, because with deep ecology, in some sphere, it has a bad rap, because the intrinsic value of nature, instead of, in contrast to things that are being attacked, which is anthropocentrism, how nature has value only because of its use for human beings. For example, how the land we are to care for, because if we over farmed, or in a way that if it led to desertification, then the justification is only based on what it is for us. So for philosophers who think that there is intrinsic value in nature, and then, for example, one famous deep ecologist is Eagerness, and others who happens to be a philosopher of language, and another philosopher who's also been trying to argue, push forward for the intrinsic value of nature, is Richard Sylvan, who's a logician, very famous logician from Australia, with the last man case. Imagine the world has only one person left. Which is worse, whether that before he's gonna die, he damaged whatever that's left of nature, or just leave it be? If leaving it be is a better world, then the betterness doesn't depend on human beings, because there would be no more human beings alive. So that's one way philosophers would argue for the intrinsic, in a way that it's valuable, not for other beings such as human beings. And but the problem is that that's something that we cannot justify to politician, or in any way in the public sphere, because people care more about money and how and even with regard to sustainability, resources, we can only talk about, for example, people talk about the good of a resting period for fishermen, for fishery, because overfishing would disturb the food chain, and then in the end we will not have the same resources, the same variety and for consumption. How it is that when we care about nature, but we have to justify that to other people who has to care about the numbers on the ledger, and that's something that I think even especially philosophers are in a very much better position to think about, because of first of all they might be more well versed in the philosophy of the morality of deep ecology, for example, and what and how it would impact us, that would make a difference to politicians or even voters and even consumers. So that's how I think would be one approach that would illustrate the importance of engagement of philosophers, intellectuals, academics in the public sphere. So that's one thing. And on the other hand, to put what I think about in decision theory and game theory to practice, that's a project that I did some time ago, and because the politics of global warming, it involves other people, and how cooperation could be better understood through, for example, game theory. And if you the Nash equilibrium and also the prisoner's dilemma, because one way to understand it, one way the prisoner's dilemma could be applied to understand the problem with climate change is that if everyone emits no greenhouse gas, that's at the present rate it's almost impossible. If one of them did, then the gross domestic product of the country would be much better. The economic growth would be better, and those that did not, they did well for nature, but they would have been outrun economically on the global platform, and thus lose out. If everyone abide by the same rule, then that's a better world. But if only one defected, then other people's cooperative effort would have been lost, or even they would be worse off than the defector. So, roughly put, if we were to agree to impose for example, a carbon tax, increasing the cost of defection, given that it's agreement not to emit too much or up to a certain degree. The Paris Agreement, it has a certain set. The goal of the Paris Agreement is not to increase the temperature at a global level too much across a certain time. So that's one way how philosophy or even economists could participate in thinking about cooperation, and at the policy-making level, given it involves other countries and other interest groups, it involves politics. And on the other hand, besides politics and going strictly to economics, I've also tried to talk about how, for example, in the food production industry, I think it's a well-known fact that there are, given the profit maximization motive of almost every companies in a free market driven capitalistic society minimize the cost, maximize the benefit. That leaves, for example, a very poor living condition of livestock. However, in return, the food is the meat produced of less quality, and also because of the how massive the production is, there are many food waste. A lot of meat is wasted, whether imported in other countries, and even in Hong Kong, not all purchased meat are consumed, and that's not a good sign. That's a waste of resources and how much water it would have been used. But if with a better coordination among various manufacturers, given that the incentives is also to but to make money on the one hand, and also to have quality produce, because for manufacturers to care about the welfare of animals, that's another thing about what philosophers we talk about morality, what's the right thing to do, but for the people who are really doing business, that's not their concern. And on the other hand, if those that without a fair trade, without social corporate responsibility, or nowadays there's also ESG. Without these things as a at a level to, for example, as a reputation, with reputation as an incentive, it's not easy for even those that want to take care of the environment to do well, because they would be very easily out-competed by those that do the most cost-effective way of manufacturing. Okay, hold on. and of course, food production, that's one thing, and also fossil fuel companies, because their vested interest is in energy. On the one hand, given that it's not renewable because of how fossil fuels, how oil comes about. So to focus on how they are motivated. I also try to think of some game and decision theoretic proposal to handle the problem. Okay, and lastly, there's also something about, because it's been a heated debate. Well, not heated debate, but there's been an agenda of setting a net zero, the carbon emission, and how it is recycled into in the carbon cycle. How the balance is to be struck at a certain time. That people, national leaders, have been setting such goal. But given what we know about, even if we were to stop all carbon emission, greenhouse gas emission at a certain time, it still takes quite a long time for the environment to return to pre-industrial, pre-industrialization era. I don't know the science, but given the accumulation to be too much sometime down the line, there will be a point that's irreversible. And I also try to motivate the rationality of, given the uncertainty, it is always more reasonable, even always more rational to aim at real zero as early as possible. And yeah, so all this goes back to the point about sustainability, because one way for something to be sustainable is simply for an external system, such as when we sustainable development goal, and especially to think about development in poor country. There's a difference between in a certain village they don't have clean water, and some people from the outside help them to take well. That's good, but once the well is gone dry or get polluted, then they will need external help later. And a better way, of course, that's been in the practice of development projects. Instead, they teach those people to use the tools to dig wells, and they also can help the local community. And one thing about the local community helping themselves, developing in whatever way that would better their lives, the cooperation and how they get to solve problems together would actually, through solidarity, makes the whole aid project to be more beneficial. So economically, or at a political level, politicians and policymakers, they want something quantifiable, measurable. That's very important, I think. So they know how well they do, and they can put it on record and compare, especially somewhere down the line when not everyone can go back and explain what they did. But we see that just aiming at later generations having the same resources lacks something, and that's one way I think we could illustrate how philosophers, knowing roughly what a policy is, could contribute to the whole battle against global warming. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ray. I think your work is very important. First of all, especially here in Brazil, we have a very big problem here with the destruction of Amazonia, and a very, very big problem with the destruction of our indigenous community. So I think this is very, very important to think, because we are thinking with the question of money too. So it's very dangerous for, like, for example, our indigenous community. So I think this is very important to think. So we now will pass to Yasmin. I will put she here now. So Yas, you can start. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you. Excellent presentation, Ray. I will put a question after. I'll ask you a question after my presentation, because it's a really interesting discussion. So good morning, everyone. I'm a PhD student at Unifesp, as Leticia said, and a guest researcher at Université Paris 8 in France, with a scholarship granted by CAPS Foundation. And I'm also part of the organizing committee of this third Unifesp Philosophy Graduate Conference, and I'd like to thank sincerely to my colleagues, my friends, for all the dedicated work they did to make this conference possible. So the title of my talk is The Warlike Logic of Power from Clausewitz to Foucault, and it represents a small part of the ideas I've been developing in the first chapter of my dissertation. My main object of analysis here is the relation between war and politics. So I'd like to begin by stating that from an ethical political point of view, my starting point is what I would call an anti-militaristic position. That is, the premise that the philosophical inquiry on war and on the relation between war and political power must be a critical one. This sort of critique can be found in a few philosophical contemporary traditions, and among those in the so-called post-structuralist thought developed by French philosophers such as Michel Foucault, Félix Guattari, and Gilles Deleuze after May 1968. And in my PhD, I approach post-structuralist thought in general to show how it works as a solid starting point for a critical study of war and of what has been called security in the past few decades. In the 70s, an important discussion about Carl Clausewitz's classic military theory emerged among these philosophers. Here, for the sake of time, I will only briefly go over the Clausewitzian definition of war and talk about some aspects of Foucault's thought on the subject, on this theme, this problem. The central thesis of Clausewitz's main work on war can be synthesized in the formula or a basic statement, that is, war is the continuation of politics by other means. In order to make sense of the formula, however, it is necessary to make reference to the textual construction that Clausewitz presents in his definition of the nature of the phenomenon of war. According to him, the ultimate purpose of a war is to compel an adversary to obey or to submit to our will. All intermediate or immediate objectives are aimed at achieving this ultimate purpose. Considering that the adversary will put up a defense, in order to achieve this ultimate end, it will be necessary to use a violence that could make this defense untenable. In this sense, the immediate military objective of any war will be to completely break the enemy's resistance and place him in the worst possible defensive situation, one that makes it impossible for him to continue engaged in the conflict. Thus, summarized Clausewitz, and I quote him, war is an act of violence, perpetrated to constrain the adversary to submit to our will. So, if the ultimate end of war is to force the enemy to submit, would it not be possible to make use of strategies in which bloodshed is minimal? Clausewitz promptly dismisses this possibility by arguing that in warfare, the only consequence of giving up physical violence would be to retreat to a position of greater disadvantage. As Frederick Gross points out, war puts death on the stage like no other human phenomenon or experience, as it demands that individuals kill and expose themselves to death consciously and systematically. The soldier's moral and even existential dilemma is grounded on this exceptional situation of being face-to-face with death, with killing and dying. Clausewitz not only recognizes this role of the centrality of lethal physical violence to the definition of war, but also affirms its necessity and unavoidability in the practical conduct of warfare. Therefore, from the point of view of the pure concept of war, any theory that's for Clausewitz, any theory that would not recognize the postulate that warfare supposes a kind of violence that tends to unlimited escalation would be incomplete. The only counterweight to the employment of unrestricted physical violence by one side is the same unrestricted physical violence employed by the other. This is then the first tendency to extremes in the Clausewitzian definition. War is a form of unlimited and brutal violence, which can go as far as a complete annihilation of the enemy. It is a frontal collision between two forces that try to subject each other to the same kind of violence. There is also a second tendency to extremes regarding the immediate objectives of each of the sides involved. Both aim at leading the other to the worst possible defensive situation, as I said. That is, both seek to destroy the enemy's capacity of resistance, the enemy's capabilities, imposing total defeat or at least an imminent total defeat, foreseeing that later recomposition of the opposing force would allow a resumption of the defense or a counter-offensive. Finally, to break through the adversary defenses, it is crucial to correctly evaluate its capabilities. And for this, it is necessary to have to have information about the extent of its material resources like tactics and weapons, and moral resources like what is the motivation of the enemy for the confrontation. Again, this will be done by all those involved in the conflict, so that we have a third tendency to extremes, according to Clausewitzian theory. Both sides will seek to assess the capabilities of the other to dose the intensity of their response. These three tendencies, these three reciprocal interactions, are, however, only the features of a logical form of war. It's pure concept. This abstract concept describes the ideal or absolute war, that in which the course of this collision of forces encounters no obstacle outside warfare itself. It is, in short, about what war is de iuris, its nature and essence, its pure tendency. But in fact, in concrete or empirical effectiveness, wars are limited by the determinations of their purpose, that of constraining the enemy to submit to our will. But who really is the subject of this will that targets an enemy and aims to submit him? Clausewitz's entire theory is based on the unquestioned assumption that the actors involved will always be nation states. It is this political subject, the state, that conjures up warfare to achieve its own ends. Therefore, absolute war is an abstract, transcendental idea to which concrete empirical wars can become more or less alike according to the political will of the state. And I quote Clausewitz. We see then that war is not only a political act, but a political instrument, a continuation of political relations, a realization of this by other means. So for Clausewitz, even though military action is guided by objectives with their own grammar, so to speak, it is these military actions it's subject to the political ends pursued by the state. Thus, ultimately, war is a field of action with only relative autonomy, since it finds its meaning only in the domain of politics. Conversely, if politics finds in warfare a primordial instrument through which it can stand its exercise, one can reasonably ask which consequences this relation has for the understanding of politics itself. In the 70s, Foucault gave a series of lectures in Collège de France that were published under the title Society Must Be Defended. In these lectures, the French philosopher presents an analytic of political power drawn from a reversal of the Clausewitzian formula. By this reversal, Foucault contested the naturalness with which Clausewitz presupposes the state as the political subject par excellence, and suspending this presupposition, sought to understand which were the real historical conditions under which Clausewitz could develop his formula. For Foucault, the institutions of power are grounded on constitutive and microphysical relations of force, to which the most appropriate matrix of analysis is precisely war as concept. So I quote Foucault, the relations of power, rapport de pouvoir, as they function in a society such as ours, have essentially as their anchor a certain relation of force, rapport de force, established at a given moment, historically assignable in war and by war. So this is not a metaphor, an interpretation that would lead us to understand that power is like a war. The Foucauldian hypothesis that what we call political life or civil peace is nothing but the continuity of the relations of force established in an originary war. The French philosopher states that the end of a particular war does not determine a total ending of these relations of force that were previously operating in it. On the contrary, civil peace will always be the crystallization of an imbalance determined by conflict, a previous conflict, armed conflict. This original civil war is repeatedly reinscribed as political power, and I quote Foucault again, in institutions, in economic inequalities, in language, even in each body. This would then be the first sense to attribute to this reversal of Clausewitz's aphorism. Politics is war continued by other means. So Foucault will give primacy in this way to the Nietzschean hypothesis, according to which the relations of forces in conflict translate as power relations in the political field. War is no longer understood as an instrument of state power, as in Clausewitz, but on the contrary, state power and institutions of powers in general, such as the armed forces, are articulate to a multiplicity of relations of force whose matrix of intelligibility is the originary civil wars. Besides, according to his hypothesis, Clausewitz's theory itself must be situated historically and traced back to its concrete conditions of enunciation. In this sense, the Clausewitzian concepts can be seen as intellectual byproducts of the European order consolidated in the late modernity, after the Peace of Westphalia and the completion of the long process of professionalization of the military institution. So when Foucault reverses the Clausewitzian formula to say that politics is the continuation of war by other means, he's seeking to develop a reflection on how power works and how it produces social forms. The concept of war and the historical study of real wars are invoked in this context because they imply the existence of clashing forces. If anything should be retained from Clausewitz's definition of war, is this: war is a collision of forces that seek each of them to dominate the other. But for Foucault, it's essential that we see that the subject of force is not the nation state. The reversal of the formula leads us to re-encounter Nietzschean philosophy, which conceives force or the relation of force in an ontological sense. Relations of force constitute reality, including social, political, and historical reality. War is still the privileged concept to an analytic of power, of political power, because, as Foucault says, even though warfare and relation of forces are not the same, the first is the extreme case of the latter. It reveals its nature. Foucault summarizes, and I quote him again: humanity does not gradually progresses from combat to combat until it arrives at universal reciprocity, where the rule of law finally replaces warfare. Humanity installs each one of its violences within a system of norms, and thus proceeds from domination to domination. The nature of these rules allows violence to be inflicted on violence, and the resurgence of new forces that are sufficiently strong to dominate those in power. Now, when Foucault draws the consequences of this Nietzschean hypothesis, he speaks mainly about political power in the European context and largely neglects colonialism. That leads him to affirm, for example, that the modern state racism dates more or less from the 19th century. There has been wide criticism about this problem in Foucault's philosophy, but I'd like to suggest that it does not invalidate the logic of his hypothesis. We could, following Foucault, think about the relation between colonial wars and contemporary political power. If politics is the continuation of war by other means, then it's reasonable to point out that institutions of power such as the armed force and the police today are built to serve as a means of continuation of colonial wars. This could also give a completely different meaning to Foucault's analysis of state racism. When we look at the history of countries marked by colonial violence, it is not difficult to see how social conflicts today relate to it. We can find elements for an analysis of the relation between colonial wars and contemporary politics in the works of authors such as Achille Mbembe or Henrique Aliès and Maurizio Lazzarato. For Mbembe, colonial violence inaugurated modern racism and engendered a kind of political power that operates by the administration and distribution of death, which he calls necropolitics. Aliès and Lazzarato suggest that we should understand colonial wars in terms of originary accumulation of capital, a type of accumulation that, far from being just a first movement in the history of capitalism, is in fact a permanent process, essential to the very existence of the economic system. That means that capitalism still heavily depends on warfare, even today in its finance-dominated form. In conclusion, I'd like to suggest that Clausewitz's theory may help us to understand conventional wars, that is, wars between nation-states with their regular armies, but is largely insufficient to help us understand more complex political processes that comprise scattered forms of warlike violence. On the other hand, although needing clarification and even correction in several points, Foucault's perspective offers an interesting framework for us to reflect on how the logic of war is present on contemporary politics, or how mutated forms of warlike violence can emerge on social life. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yasmin. I liked so much your work. I think it has a close relation with the moment that we are living on the world. And I think this has a close relation to with like a technological war and algorithmic war too, like fake news and these things. And thank you very much. We will pass now to the question session. So I'll put Ray here too. So I will start now with the question of Yasmin. So you can ask now, Yasmin.
So Ray, again, thank you very much for your presentation. I was not familiar with this discussion about Nash equilibrium. And it's very, very interesting to think about the ecological problem from this perspective. But it seems to me that this leads us to think about intrinsic problem with economic growth. And I don't know, maybe we should think about not a sustainable growth, but a sustainable and responsible decrease in economic activity. I don't know, it's just, I'm guessing. I don't know, it's just a reflection. I don't know. But I would like to know what you think about it. And if you have read something about this, what is the discussion about the possibility of actually decreasing economic activity? Or if this is not, it isn't a thing.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Well, if we were to justify the growth economically, I think a very simple way is, for example, desertification, over farming, and yeah, economically, because we have to distinguish between growth and development. I think to grow, well, for an economy to grow, well, one way to measure it is how much more in terms of GDP like a country in terms of the because it also interacts with how economically trade and currency, all these things, instead of merely thinking about the resources. And quite some time ago, people have been thinking about economics in terms of not only about money, not economic growth, not only about money and welfare, happiness, and also if another way to think about it is in terms of how well one can do. And I think that's where how more things one can do, because in terms of development, and Nussbaum, Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, they propose something beyond money, beyond happiness, but the capability approach. That's something that's been building up. But to answer the question, even if we were to justify in terms of economic growth, there's a difference between growth without development. And one way to illustrate that is whether that growth is roughly put from within, because because one way to grow is, for example, just some could be making the same amount of goods, but the growth is simply through changes in the trading condition, and in whatever way the demand and supply would have made a difference to the measurable economic growth, but without any improvement in the original system, let alone that the resources are scarce, and whether that growth, even the growth is sustainable, given the practice is still the same. So that would in fact motivate the growth, even from the perspective of sustainable development. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your response. I need to read a lot more about this.
Thank you, Ray. So I will do another question to Ray. I'll put here on the video. So it's Victor's question, and I will read quickly here. So do you have any references about agroecology in this issue of climate activism? If yes, can you talk about this a little? Just curious.
Well, it's a new word for me, but if it relates to something in the literature or in the discussion under the name of nature-based solution, I think that's something that people have spent a lot of time talking about, like learning from nature. How usually it doesn't stay only with agriculture, but like even design of a various architectural space. So that's yeah, that's the short answer that I would have.
Okay, so now we will pass to Yasmin. I will put here the question. So I'll put it on English, or like, no, I'll put it on Portuguese first, then I put on English, ok? So, se a política é a continuação da guerra por outros meios, Foucault inverte, você diria que nesse ataque ao inimigo também se inclui a resistência ou não? Apenas um comentário. So I will let here the English version too. So can go.
Thank you, Victor. That's a really interesting question, a difficult one. Like Enrique Aliès and Maurizio Lazzarato, when they study this reversal of Clausewitzian formula through Foucault, they put all that in terms of class struggle and class wars, so to speak. So yes, there would be some resistance against capitalism, against bourgeoisie. It would be really a clashing of forces between workers and capitalist elite. But well, I don't know. I think this is really important to for us to question about like the ethics of defense and resistance in terms of when we use this kind of reasoning drawing from war, you know, because there's a problem with the ethics of violence. So I don't know. I would be. It's possible to analyze politics in this way, but I would say that we need to be careful. We need to be careful with the ethical implications of this kind of reasoning. But it's like a big discussion. It's a large discussion that's very open, still open in philosophy today. For myself, I as I said, I have a anti-militarist position. So we need to have a really solid critique of violence, even for resistance, you know, even for defense, people's defense, etc. But it's something I'm still elaborating. It's a very hard question, but thank you. It's something important for all of us maybe to think about.
Okay, thank you, Yas. So now, does anybody has any questions to do? Can we finish? Okay. So I will say thank you once again. And we are very, very proud to be doing this work here. And I would like to say thank you again to Canal Agenciamentos, Channel Agenciamentos. And I would like to ask to the public that are listening to us, watching us, to watch to the next communication that will start on 10 a.m., 10 o'clock. And what else? Let me see. Well, this is it. I think this is very important to our formation in our master's and doctoral degrees too. And I think it's it. So thank you very much, guys. We are finished now. And goodbye.
Thank you very much, Leticia, Ray. That's been really nice to watch and to participate in the conference and to organize the conference too. Thank you very much, really.
Bye bye, guys.